Hi, we're gonna go and just jump straight into this. Hi, my name is Jessa. Please join me as we look together at top 10 unsettling war punishments not for the faint heart. Number 10, Agent Orange. The vile war in Vietnam was brutal as the spread of violence echoed throughout each neighboring village. Agent Orange is a highly toxic chemical herbicide used by the United States as part of their onslaught against the Vietnamese. According to the US, they stated it was an herbicide to specifically clear vegetation in the dense forests and jungles of Vietnam, as well as the neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia. Due to the fact that American forces were having difficulty finding Vietnamese troops in the forest, they chose to use this highly toxic chemical that not only destroyed their ecosystem but had caused tremendous health issues in the civilians that were caught in between the line of fire. Military personnel on both ends had experienced a long range of health issues, including various skin conditions, cancers, neurological disorders, as well as women in Vietnam experienced birth defects and miscarriages, as there was a significant number of birth defects in their offspring. 2.18 million gallons of Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, and even though there had been multiple addresses of the United States' reckless decision on using toxic gases, Dow Chemical Company, who sold the herbicide to the military, denied all liability and said no danger to human health. And like all injustices, the Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the suit. And sure, some of the US veterans and their families got compensation, but still many of them have mental health issues like PTSD. As well as for the Vietnamese, the ones whose land got destroyed by the US, to this day their trees still won't grow back. Number 9, white phosphorus. Just like Agent Orange that can cause tremendous casualties, white phosphorus is prohibited as it is subjected to the international humanitarian law. It is prohibited to use white phosphorus as an incendiary weapon against civilian populations and in areas where there is a concentration of civilians. Here's why. I know it might be too graphic for our editors to put in, but as a viewer, I ask you to Google image white phosphorus burns and see why it should not be used. The issue with white phosphorus is that it makes it smoke through burning, and because they burn extremely hot, they are difficult to extinguish, which as a result we see if you look up the images why the results look like the way it does. The burning particles adhere to skin and can continue to cause damage even after the initial contact, which is why we see multiple holes burned into the skin, as white phosphorus can cause deep burns, all the way down to and even through the bone, and it can reignite even after initial treatment. So if you can imagine being dropped on this on you as a civilian and you have your family with kids, the result is tragic and inhumane. Its everlasting effects can be vile and devastating, and just like Agent Orange in Lebanon, where they got attacked with white phosphorus from the Israeli forces, who right now is still bombing Gaza with white phosphorus, the burning of the Lebanese woods and forests include more than 40,000 ancient olive trees, exacerbated the environmental impact of the conflict. Number 8, targeting hospitals. When it comes to targeting civilians of nations when a war takes place, deliberating attacks on medical facilities and personnel depriving civilians of crucial healthcare is a war crime and an extreme punishment as a result of conflict and war. Hospitals and medical personnel are protected under international humanitarian law. Targeting hospitals and medical personnel intentionally and as strategy of war is a war crime. Additional provisions of Article 19 under the Geneva Convention still allow hospitals to be protected even if it defends itself or has small arms and ammunition taken from the wounded. In 2008, Sri Lankan armed forces have launched attacks that struck hospitals. Tens of thousands of civilians have been held hostages as shields by the armed forces, and many of the Sri Lankan armed forces unlawfully forced civilians' populations along with them in retreat. When medical staff at the Valayan Madam Hospital were doing their rounds, they found themselves in the middle of an aerial attack. One aid worker noted that as they were at the hospital, they noticed drones and everyone was getting down to cover. Then a barrage of bullets came. One of the doctors who was lying next to them was killed in a shrapnel piece that hit them in the head. 4 or 5 people were killed and more than 30 were wounded in that attack. Despite these crimes that occurred in the hospitals or medical grounds, the Human Rights Watch calls all to the UN, but like as of right now, it seems like the UN does practically nothing. Number 7, starvation and denial of humanitarian aid. The people of Gaza were cut off clean water, electricity, and access to any of the coming food by the occupying Israeli government in the early of October 2023. As of right now, there is no food in Gaza, and they're resorting to drinking salt water from the sea, as well as in order to charge their phone devices to reach out to family members or to show outreach to people what's happening in Gaza, they are charging their phones with car batteries on the roadside or trying to use solar panels that they have to get power. As of right now, over 10,000 Palestinians have died at the hands of the Israeli forces, who many of casualties are children, but that doesn't include the ones who have died of starvation, dehydration, or malnutrition. Even in a documentary born in Gaza based on the onslaught that occurred in 2014, their boats were destroyed again by Israeli forces, who were only allowed to fish less than 5 miles from the land. Starvation is a tactic used constantly in wars as a way to discipline or dismantle the spirits of the people they are occupying. Humanitarian aid workers unimplemented access to populations in dire needs of states that are using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare may constitute as a war crime. And according to the IIEA, the use of starvation of civilians populations as a method of warfare is prohibited by international law. Number 6, forced labor. Also known as slavery, as we know, consists of enslaving another person as property and ownership into bondage. And in history, my God, there were slaves everywhere. From ancient Greeks, who were known for taking prisoners of war as slaves and mistreating them as an aggressive degree as there were no laws to protect them, as well as ancient Egypt and in ancient Rome. And as we know with our modern history, slavery conducted in Latin America was an economic and social institution that existed before the colonial era. After the conquest of Latin America by the Spanish and Portuguese, of the nearly 12 million slaves that were shipped across the Atlantic, over 4 million enslaved Africans Africans were brought to Latin America. As of today, according to the Walk Free map, an estimated 50 million people were living in modern slavery on a given day in 2021, and an increase of 10 million since 2016. As well as their index, 2023 has placed the US among the small group of nations, which also includes China, North Korea, and Russia, over its compulsory prison labor. Number 5, forced displacement. Andrew Jackson, a president of the United States, was known for many things, but most notably his onslaught of the native indigenous that brought forth the Trail of Tears. He signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which led to the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. Despite it being a negotiation in the act, these treaties weren't negotiations at all, but an ultimatum to the indigenous of these lands. The actual removal process was often brutal and devastating, leading to the deaths of thousands of Native Americans. In 1948, 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, fled, and were expelled from their homes as well. 70 massacres by the Israeli forces atrocities led to 15,000 Palestinians' deaths. As of right now, over 10,000 civilians, as I mentioned, being them children, are dead as they've been killed by the IDF. And as of right now, civilians of the northern Gaza are forced to leave their homes towards the south of the border Khan Yunis, which now the Gazans call the second Nakba. History repeats itself in different fonts with the same brutality but different faces, and no matter the era, it repeats. And yet we wait till the current time passes to ask ourselves, wow, they did that back then? When in reality, it's happening right now. Like in Ukraine. Ukrainians who once lived in Ukraine are now displaced in refuge all over the world to avoid the war. And right now, like in Congo, an estimated 6.1 million people are currently internally displaced in DRC as of October 2022 and now. Which gives us another question. Why are these indigenous people on these lands refugees in their own country? Number 4, firing squad. Execution by firing squad is another war crime as well as punishment in the time of war. A firing squad is normally composed of several soldiers, all of whom are usually instructed to fire simultaneously, thus preventing both distribution of the process of one member and identification of who fired the lethal shot. To avoid disfigurement due to multiple shots to the head, the shooters are typically instructed to aim at the heart, sometimes aided by a paper or a cloth target. Jose Rizal, a Filipino revolutionary who aided in the spark of the Filipino resilience against the Spanish colonization and occupation of the land, died by firing squad. But because Filipinos are gang AF, he told them, "Don't shoot me from behind. If you're going to shoot me, look at me into the eyes when you do it." The commander of the firing squad refused, and Jose did whatever he could to face death on his own terms, and when the sun rose with him dying, his last breath was "Consumptum est," which means it is finished. Firing squads were very common in the times of war as a way to kill prisoners of war, captive soldiers, traitors, and even civilians. Number 3, mutilation. Forms of mutilation go through all kinds of brutal acts, from slicing to cutting to firing a battery of attacks. Even from the chemicals used in war mentioned earlier is also a form of mutilation. But to get a little personal, on my dad's side we had a guerrilla troop in World War II of just our family. And my grandfather told us that they had to fight the Japanese at night and sleep in the trees during the day in order to avoid being caught. But because of their tactics of killing the Japanese soldiers undetected, it pissed off a lot of the Japanese troops. So what would happen is that they would intimidate and raid barangays or villages, saying, "Hey, where's the guerrilla troops and where are they hiding?" Because the villagers didn't know who they were talking about, they were unfortunately met with cruelty, and the Japanese soldiers would take the children, throw them up in the air, and then stab them with batons on their guns, or stuff children into barrels of water and then stab them with batons. The women would be viciously violated, and the men's heads would be off, and they would also do this in churches where they would cut off nuns and priests and their heads as well. This is war, and it is violent, and when you see the mutilation of war in real time on your phone on Instagram, you realize this is what some of our family members who have seen war might have seen, and it's very heartbreaking. Number 2, ethnic cleansing. In Yugoslavia lies the heartbreaking Bosnian genocide, of which ethnic cleansing of Bosniak or Bosnian Muslims and the Croat populations were met with ultimate violence. Bosnian Serbs forced engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, forcibly removing Bosniaks and Croats from their homes, often subjecting them to extreme violence, forcing physical harm and killing. This resulted in a significant number of refugees and internally displaced persons, and the international community initially struggled to respond effectively to the conflict. However, as the scale of atrocities came increasingly apparent, diplomats' efforts were to make broker peace led to the Dayton Agreement in 1995. The Bosnian genocide is a deeply tragic and painful chapter in recent history, and it serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that can occur when ethnic and nationalist tension escalate into violence. And finally, number 1, genocide. We know that the Holocaust is one of the worst in history in regards to mass genocide, as it resulted over 6 million Jews' lives who had died under Germany's cruel, violent government and occupation. And when it comes to genocides around the world, there are so little efforts to stop it when it occurs. In fact, there are some going on right now, as little as it being done, like in Congo, Gaza, and Sudan. And some may not know in history or might have forgotten other important, just devastating genocides in other parts of the world, like Rwanda in 1994. All in the span of 100 days of trauma, violence, statutory offenses, killings, and ethnic cleansings led to the genocide of 1,074,017 people of the Tutsi descent deaths. After the assassination of Juvenal, the Hutu president, the next state was when the genocidal killings began. Majority Hutsi soldiers, police, and militia targeted key Tutsi and modern Hutsi military political leaders. The scale and brutality of the genocide caused shock worldwide, but no country intervened to forcibly stop the killings. Most of the victims were killed in their own villages or towns, and many of their neighbors and fellow villagers as well. Hutsi gangs searched out victims hiding in churches and school buildings, and the militia killed victims with machetes and rifles, as well as massacred children who were hiding in a Polish church. War is barbaric, and world leaders should stop putting civilians at risk for their own self-interest. And just because we hear and know about the atrocities of war doesn't mean we should desensitize ourselves when we hear the numbers. These are real people. I mean, you're real. And so am I. And so are all the countless people I had mentioned whose lives were lost due to the result of selfish wars. And again, as a quote from Voltaire, history is the study of the world's crime. The riddle in the last video I was in goes like this. What breaks every day but can never be fixed? The answer is my heart. But I'm just joking, it's Dawn. Here's your next riddle. The more you see of me, the less you can see. And I visit you every day. What am I? Be sure to put your answer in the comments below and I'll reveal the answer in the next video. Top 10 disgusting facts about the ancient Hittites not told in textbooks. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe. And remember, you're doing great. Okay? Bye.